Order, order. We now come to the statement. Secretary of State Lisa Nandy.
With permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will make a statement about the BBC. As the House will be aware, this weekend the Director General and the Chief Executive Officer of News tendered their resignations following concerns about accuracy and impartiality at the BBC. This has sparked intense debate across the media and our nation, and today I want to set out for the House what action is being taken to address the allegations that have been made, the actions this government is taking to support the BBC to address this, and the future of an institution that has been at the centre of our democratic and cultural life for over a century. The House will know that yesterday the Chair of the BBC, Samir Shah, wrote to the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. He accepted there had been editorial failings and committed to a number of steps in response. Dr Shah believes that our national broadcaster, which remains one of the most trusted sources of news in our country, has a responsibility to uphold the highest standards. I agree. Over the past week, I've been in regular contact with him and his team to ensure that where these standards have not been met, firm, swift and transparent action follows. I welcome the steps that have already been set out, and I will keep the House updated as the BBC leadership grips these issues. The concerns that have been raised are serious in and of themselves, but some in this House have gone even further, suggesting that the BBC is institutionally biased. It should not be lost on us that the BBC has faced criticism from all sides for its coverage of highly contentious and contested issues, and accused of giving too much airtime to particular parties and for giving them too little. Those in this House attacking the BBC from left and right for not expressing views they agree with should consider just what is at stake. There is a fundamental difference between raising serious concerns over editorial failings and members of this House launching a sustained attack on the institution itself. Because the BBC is not just a broadcaster, it is a national institution that belongs to us all. Every day it tells the story of who we are, the people, places and communities that make up life across the UK. It projects British values, creativity and integrity to the world. It underpins our creative industries, has a footprint in our nations and regions that is unmatched by any other, and it is by far the most widely used and trusted source of news in the United Kingdom. At a time when the lines are being dangerously blurred between fact and opinion, news and polemic, the BBC stands apart. It is a light on the hill for people here and across the world. Trusted news and high-quality programming is essential to our democratic and cultural life. All of us in this House should value it, uphold it and fiercely defend it. The BBC is facing challenges, some of its own making, but it is doing so in the context of a revolution in the media landscape that has challenged all broadcasters and polarised and fragmented our national debate. It is time to grip this with a clarity of vision and purpose that secures the BBC's future. Throughout its history, Madam Deputy Speaker, the BBC has always adapted and evolved. This is an institution that began in the era of radio, when it was deemed an existential threat to the newspaper industry. It evolved into the age of mass audiences, ushered in by the invention of television, and it navigated the complexities of reporting during the Second World War. We will imminently begin the Charter Review, which will set the terms of the BBC for the next decade, and through it we will collectively write the next chapter of the BBC's story. Together we will ensure the BBC is sustainably funded, commands the public's trust and continues to drive growth, good jobs, skills and creativity across every region and nation of the UK. In an era in which trust is fraying and truth is contested across our nation, it will ensure the BBC remains fiercely independent and is genuinely accountable to the public it serves. We will publish a Green Paper and launch a public consultation shortly, and I will set out more detail to the House in the coming weeks. I would like to thank the outgoing Director General for his service and his commitment to public service broadcasting over many years. And I'd like to thank the CEO of News for leading the BBC's news operation through stormy times. I do not underestimate the challenge of taking on these roles and the personal toll that they can take on the individuals who hold them. As we write the next chapter of an institution that has stood at the centre of British public life for a century, our overarching goal is simple: to ensure the BBC can renew its mission for the modern age and continue to inform, educate and entertain, not just for the coming decade, but well into the next century. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Secretary of State.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Right Honourable Lady for advance notice of her statement. The BBC is in a sorry mess, and sadly, one of its own making, that has resulted in the resignations of the Director General and the CEO of News. These recent leadership changes are a response to the growing number of examples of bias in the BBC, one of which has resulted in a potential $1 billion lawsuit. This is why the Leader of the Opposition has said the BBC needs to change and needs saving from itself. Otherwise, we may all pay the price in reputational damage and in our pockets as licence fee payers. We all want the BBC to succeed, to be the best possible version of itself, but that requires institutional change and far more than a few moves at the top. But let me first acknowledge, Madam Deputy Speaker, some of the many good things that the BBC does well in delivering on its principles to inform, educate and entertain, from Strictly and Traitors to world-class natural history programming, sport and local radio, and coverage of major national events, including, of course, the recent remembrance services and events. These are things we can all be proud of, that contribute positively to the BBC's brand and reputation at home and abroad. But the BBC also has a charter obligation for impartiality, and too many examples have come to light exposing bias at the BBC, particularly as it relates to the news and current affairs output. Examples that have often strayed far away from the BBC's own editorial guidelines. The coverage of trans rights, selective push notifications of news, the Gaza documentary, the output of the Arabic News Service, reliance on stats provided by Hamas, all speak to bias at the BBC. And at a time when anti-Semitism is rising around the world, the BBC should surely think twice about distributing questionable data from a terrorist organisation bent on the destruction of Israel. We expect better from our national broadcaster. And I'm glad that the BBC chair has admitted an error of judgment relating to the Panorama programme on Donald Trump, which involved editing of his speech to give the impression that he said something that he did not say. The BBC now faces a hefty lawsuit, and we do not want to see the taxpayer, the licence fee payer, or the rest of the BBC suffer because of the poor judgment of Panorama programme makers who seem unable to distinguish opinion from impartial journalism, who clearly all thought the same. And that's precisely the problem. It's remarkable that in every area of their operations, the BBC seeks inclusivity and diversity other than in thought, other than in political thinking. Does the Minister agree that that must change, that the BBC's culture needs to change? And does the Minister agree that the BBC must provide a fulsome apology to the US President and hopefully avoid legal action? And does she agree that the BBC would do well to apologise to the British public too? Does she also agree we need a root and branch review of the BBC's adherence to impartiality, particularly as it relates to news and current affairs, and that we need more than apologies and resignations at the top, but clear actions on complaints processing, on governance, on oversight and on compliance to ensure that the BBC sticks to its charter obligations on impartiality and that it rigidly and consistently abides by its own editorial guidelines. The Minister did mention the next steps in the BBC Charter review, but we would appreciate more details on timelines as soon as possible. And could she confirm, though, what discussions she's currently having with the BBC leadership about the search for the new Director General? And given that the BBC Arabic service is funded in part by the British taxpayer through FCDO grants, can she confirm what discussions she is having with her FCDO colleagues about its future funding and governance arrangements, and about the impact the BBC's editorial failings have had with Israel and our partners in the Middle East? Action must be taken, and the serious issues discussed today must be addressed, Madam Deputy Speaker, because the BBC must become, once again, an institution that all of us, not just some of us, can be proud of.
Yeah.
Secretary of State.
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman? I know this has been an issue that has been of serious concern to him as it's unfolded over the past week. And can I say to him from the outset that I do strongly agree with him that 2 resignations are not the answer to the challenges that the BBC has faced, not just over the last week, but in recent months. I've come to this House too many times to share with the House progress updates on editorial failings. He mentioned some in relation to Gaza and to Glastonbury, but there have been others as well. I'm pleased that the chairman of the BBC, Dr. Samir Shah, has accepted where the institution has made mistakes. I'm pleased that he's been open with the chair of the Select Committee about that, and I'm pleased that he is setting out concrete actions that follow. I agree very much with the honourable gentleman that clear actions are important. They must be swift and they must be robust and they must be transparent. I also strongly agree with him that there is a problem of consistency in the way that those standards are consistently applied, which leaves individual journalists and individual presenters in a very difficult position. And that is a point that I've made to the Chairman and previously to the Director General. In terms of the search for the Director General, I have had discussions with the Chairman of the Board about that. The House should be aware that the Government does not appoint the Director General. As set out in the Charter, that is solely a matter for the Board, but we stand ready to provide support where it's requested and necessary in order to make sure that we get the highest calibre individual. I understand from the board that there is a desire to move quickly on that, but that the existing Director General will remain in place to ensure a smooth transition, and I will update the House as I receive further information. He also asked particularly about the BBC Arabic service and funding for the World Service. I think it's important to recognise that there have been serious concerns and failings on the part of the BBC Arabic service. In response to that, in his letter to the chair of the Select Committee, Dr. Shah set out a number of steps that are being taken. I understand these include structural changes as well as individual staff changes. But I would gently push back against the assertion that this should affect our support for the World Service. The World Service is a light on the hill for people in places of darkness, and there are many in the world at the moment, and this government strongly supports the World Service and will continue to do so.
Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Whatever the case with Donald Trump, who has actually said far worse than the wrongly edited clip showed, and it is a wrongly edited clip, the only ones rubbing their hands in glee right now during this whole debacle is those that do not want a free press. Those politicians who have deep pockets lined by goodness knows who. Those politicians that cosplay being journalists on RT and GB News, spreading division and hatred. I hope that all of us in this House would agree with the principle of keeping our public broadcaster free from political interference. So does the Secretary of State agree that it's time to review the influence of former Conservative spin doctor Robbie Gibb on the BBC's board?
Secretary of State.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her question? In relation to the board, she will be aware that the Charter sets a strict legal threshold that must be met before dismissal of a board member, and so I am unable to pursue the course of action that she suggests.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Anna Sabine.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Liberal Democrats have always pushed the BBC to be better, delivering genuinely balanced reporting, rigorous investigation and the best journalism in the world. We believe in a strong, independent, publicly funded BBC that values factuality, scrutiny and accountability in our democracy. The BBC clearly isn't perfect, and it's right that we hold it to the highest standards. The Panorama editing error was a serious mistake, and we welcome the BBC's apology. The resignations of Tim Davie and Deborah Turness must be an opportunity for the BBC to turn a new leaf, to rebuild trust and return to its core mission to inform, educate and entertain. However, it is obvious to everyone that this issue is being weaponised by those who want to undermine the BBC and who would profit from its demise. Without the BBC, we are more vulnerable to the dangerous misinformation and conspiracy theories that populists like the member for Clacton and Donald Trump trade on, and we cannot let that happen. So as the government navigates Trump's latest tantrum, threatening to sue the BBC for $1 billion, can I ask the Secretary of State, what is she doing to stand up for the BBC, Britain's BBC, which is the most trusted source of information in the world? And speaking of interference by bad actors, serious concerns remain over the conduct of Sir Robbie Gibb during his tenure on the BBC board. We need to have absolute confidence that the BBC can operate free from political influence, factional interest or personal agendas. So if the Secretary of State truly believes in an independent BBC, will she now also sack Robbie Gibb, end the political grip on the BBC board and listen to Liberal Democrat calls to guarantee that the appointment of the next Director General is transparent, impartial and worthy of the trust that British public places in the BBC?
Thank the Honourable Lady. It's difficult to hear her over the noise, but she asks if we will stand up for the BBC. I think she's heard my words to the House today. The BBC is one of the most important institutions in the country. It stood at the centre of our democratic and cultural life for over a century. And how will we stand up for the BBC? By putting it on a firm footing through the charter process that we're about to start. She will have heard, in relation to her concerns about board members, she will have heard that the answer that I gave to my honourable friend.
Rupert Hook.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for her leadership on this and wholeheartedly welcome her words that political figures shouldn't be presenters of the news. Surely this should also apply to arbiters of news standards. I wonder if in the reforms we could look at the 4-person Editorial Standards Committee, now that 2 of them have gone in the resignations, leaving the most senior one, someone who's owned a newspaper in this time, breaching the IPC guidelines, the ex-Conservative Director of Communications, Robbie Gibb.
She mentions the Editorial Standards Committee, the ESGC, which has been the source of much debate and scrutiny over recent days. I have discussed this directly with the chair of the BBC. I understand that changes are planned to that committee, and I very much welcome that decision.
Chair of the Select Committee, Dame Caroline Dining.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Chair. Thank you to the Secretary of State for her statement, and I'd like to echo her words about the Director General and the Head of News. She'll know that the airwaves over the last couple of days have been dominated by a number of debates around the BBC, the concern about bias, particularly in some of the most contentious issues, the ability of the board to effectively govern, but most of all around editorial standards and accuracy. And it's this last point which has led the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, which I chair, to issue invitations today for non-executive members of BBC Editorial Guidance and Standards Committee, Dr Samir Shah, Caroline Thompson and Robbie Gibb, and the former external independent advisors, Michael Prescott and Caroline Daniels, to appear before us in the weeks ahead. In the meantime, can I ask the Secretary of State, what support is her department giving the BBC at every level to steady this ship? And in terms of charter review, I heard her use the words imminently and shortly, but I have heard similar words since the beginning of the year, so I wonder if she can be more specific on the timelines.
Secretary of State.
Thank you. Can I first of all welcome the action that her Select Committee is taking, that she's announced to the House today. I think in order to maintain confidence in the BBC, it's absolutely essential that the BBC is transparent about the actions that they've taken and the actions they intend to take. And it is very welcome that she is ensuring that the fullest explanation is given, not just to this House, but to the public as well. In terms of the timing of the Charter review, she will have heard what I said to her committee when I appeared before them recently, that we will start that Charter review process before the end of the year. And I will, of course, return to this House as soon as those timings are finalised in order to put that before the House and give members the chance to debate that. She also asked what action we as a government are taking to support the board through what is clearly a tumultuous time. I've been working very closely with the chairman of the BBC in recent days. I've spoken to him daily and the Director General as well. And we have been clear as a government that we stand ready to provide all of the support that the board needs in order to appoint the highest calibre person to that post of Director General and to consider what changes they might want to make to senior leadership structures and roles as a result of the deliberations that they've had. Of course, the BBC is independent of government. It's essential that they're given the space to be able to get on with this process. But we have been working very closely with the BBC chairman at his request in order to make sure that the BBC can continue to thrive.
Natasha Irons.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think now more than ever, the role of the BBC in our national story, in our democracy and in the trust that we put in it is vitally important. But trust isn't given, it is earned, and we can't shy away from when things go wrong. So does she agree with me that the Charter should focus on transparency, accountability and measurable commitments to impartiality as the surest way to ensure that the BBC's trust is retained?
Secretary State.
I do agree with the honourable member. I would just add to that as well as the very important issues around standards, trust, accountability and independence from government, any government, including ours, because the BBC plays a critical role in holding a mirror up not just to society but to governments of all political persuasions. I would just add as well that the BBC has always been one of the strongest drivers of the creative industries across every nation and region, and as part of the Charter review process we will be working to strengthen that to make sure that the BBC is able to tell the story of our whole nation and not just some.
Sir Oliver Dowden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I actually join the Culture Secretary in paying tribute to the Director General of the BBC. I actually found him rather helpful on issues such as anti-Semitism. But the problem with the BBC goes much deeper than the current leadership. Does she agree with me? First of all, it goes to the cultural disposition of the BBC, whereby people that work for it have an overwhelming metropolitan outlook and obsess about issues such as BLM and Palestine in a way that suburban and provincial England does not. Moreover, when one looks at the output of the BBC, including areas such as drama, my constituents are sick of waiting for the lecture from the BBC in that kind of output. Now, that is the case from other broadcasters, but the difference with the BBC is that my constituents pay for it. And there is a real problem with the BBC now, whereby many people feel that it represents half of the United Kingdom, not the other half. And for those of us who want the BBC to succeed, does she agree with me this must be addressed as a matter of urgency?
Well, the challenges that he describes don't specifically relate just to the BBC. I have voiced concerns, as many culture secretaries on the other side of this House have done previously, about the overwhelming concentration of the media industry from one background and in one region. And I believe, as many of my predecessors on the other side of this House believe, that that does need to change. But I would just caution the focus particularly on the BBC here, because that is a problem for the media industry as a whole and therefore for the public debate that we're able to have. And actually the BBC over the years, through the work that they've done at Media City in Salford, through the work that they're doing at Digbeth Lock in Birmingham, is one of the organisations that is at the forefront of changing that. I agree with him, though, that there has to be a level of challenge, internal challenge, within any successful organisation. And in the discussions that I've been having with the chairman of the BBC and the Director General in recent days, that has been the subject of a lot of the concerns that I have raised.
Bullwark.
Deputy Speaker, as a former journalist and as a former member of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee, I know more than most some of the failings of the BBC, but also some of its great strengths, not least in combating misinformation online. I know many of its journalists personally, and have to say many of them take ultra seriously their duties to provide fair, impartial and, yes, fearless news coverage. And it's the fearlessness that often upsets this place on either side. And I have to say, yes, this was a serious error by the Panorama team, and a correction should have been swiftly issued. But that doesn't mean that the BBC as an institution should be undermined. And there are enemies on left and right who want to see the demise of the BBC, who should rue that day if it ever happens.
Secretary of State.
Well, I agree with him. I agree with him, first of all, on the point that he makes about the seriousness of some of the failings and the need to uphold the higher standards. I also agree with him about the challenges and attacks that the BBC faces from both left and right. I think the real division when it comes to the debate about the BBC is not between left and right, it's between those of us who think that the national broadcaster is there to represent their worldview and those of us who believe that our national broadcaster is here to challenge all of us.
Damian Hines.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The internet is full of people who think they are in touch with a bigger truth. And in getting that across, it doesn't matter what happens to all sorts of littler truths along the way. Samir Shah, in his letter to the chair of the committee, spoke of the sacred job of the BBC to use evidence that can be trusted, and that is more important than ever. And does she agree that actually it's things like this that give ammunition to people who say disregard the BBC, don't look at the MSM, consider all sources to be the same? And isn't the most worrying thing, not that a mistake happened, because mistakes happen in big organisations, but that it took this long for it to be corrected? And does she agree that in future corrections must always be made very swiftly and proactively?
Secretary of State.
Thank you. Yeah, and this concern about the length of time that it takes to respond is something that I've reflected to the BBC leadership, not just in relation to this episode, but previously as well. I think it really does undermine trust and confidence in the BBC, because when it takes some time, if there's not a proper explanation as to why it has taken some time, it leads people to believe that there is a complacency at the top of the organisation. I think that's something that the chairman has heard loud and clear and has taken on board as part of the learning from this episode. And I also agree with him that, you know, as somebody who has shared some of my frustrations with the BBC leadership and some of the failings that have happened over the last 16 months with this House, that the reason that I and others have been frustrated is because the BBC holds such an important place in our national life and has to command the trust of the whole public.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think we can all hear the frustration of the Secretary of State that we're in this position. She's absolutely right. There must be a period of introspection at the BBC as to how this has come to pass, because it is true that trust in our national institutions is declining. I must take issue, though, with something that she said, because she said this is a national institution that belongs to us all. My constituents, and I wager people's constituents across this House, are deeply concerned by the political attacks on the BBC, whether they come from at home or abroad, and they want to see it protected because they think they own it, but the honest truth is at the moment they don't. Now, I know in the past my honourable friend has been interested in these ideas, but with Charter Renewal coming, might she meet with a group of us to look at how issues like mutualisation might be the future to giving back trust and confidence in the BBC and genuinely protecting it from forms of political institution by giving it to the public to be part of running it?
Secretary of State.
Thank you. I mean, I stand absolutely by the assertion that the BBC belongs to us all. It's funded by the licence fee payer, but more than that, it is one of the few shared spaces and places that we have in this country. I was reflecting on this on Remembrance Sunday as I stood at the cenotaph, and before that, when we did the VE commemorations earlier this year, that there are very few broadcasters in this country who could provide those moments when the entire country stops and comes together through a shared experience. And I would, of course, be delighted to meet with my honourable friend to discuss some of the suggestions that she makes.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The BBC has said that the editing of the Panorama programme gave the impression of a direct call for violent action, something that they then described as an error of judgment, which seems an extraordinary understatement. Does the Secretary of State share my concern that this was considered by the Editorial Guidelines and Standards Committee in May, but nothing was done. And should not, as a first step, the Editorial Guidelines and Standards Committee be made far tougher and fully independent? And will she consider this and other measures as part of the Charter review that she is undertaking as a way of strengthening the impartiality requirement that was inserted in the last Charter review?
Secretary of State.
Can I thank him for that suggestion, and I look forward to having more detailed conversations with him as we start the Charter review process. As a former Culture Secretary himself, I would welcome the opportunity to do so. He raises the specific issue of the committee meeting that took place in May. My understanding is that there was a meeting in January and then a further meeting in May, and that that was done at the BBC's own request, but that there was then a failure to follow through. I don't want to speak for the BBC. It's not the role of me to answer questions on behalf of the BBC about how they took those decisions, but I note with interest that the Select Committee will be calling members of that committee to appear before them, and I'm sure that will be one of the things that they will be seeking to probe.
Graham Stringer.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't think any reasonable person can think that the programme put out by Panorama was a mistake. It was clearly manipulation with a purpose. And unfortunately, it follows a long line. I'm not going to list them all, other honourable members have done that, but it includes Gaza, anti-women trans issues, Europe, and in my own constituency, a programme was put out a few years ago called People Like Us, where contributors had been paid to fight young women. Other contributors had been sent on holiday in order to say particular things. So I don't think that the biggest threat to the BBC is some conspiracy. I hope my right honourable friend agrees with me. The biggest threat to the BBC is a failure to uphold objectivity and the standards we expect from the BBC.
Secretary of State.
I mean, I absolutely share his view about the seriousness of the failings that the BBC has accepted this week and the need for clear, robust, firm and swift action in response to that. I would, though, like to just remind the House that the BBC is responsible for thousands of hours of output across multiple channels, including some of the most popular and entertaining programmes in this country, including some of the highest quality children's television output that the world has. They're responsible for the BBC World Service, which is renowned and revered the world over and plays an essential role in our global democracy, and it's responsible for regional news that is highly trusted and reaches stories and people and communities that others can't reach. I say that not to downplay in any sense the seriousness of the concerns that have been raised this week, but just to make clear that the BBC as an institution is absolutely essential to this country, and when we hold it to the highest standards, it's because we need it to thrive.
Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. To interrogate honourably, the BBC needs to have a level of integrity. Yet they have diminished themselves in ignoring a report for 6 months that didn't just look at one Panorama programme, but looked at a litany of failures. They piously show religious observance to the principles of integrity and impartiality, but when challenged and when criticised, they sacrifice all of that on the altar of supreme arrogance. And today, hearing that the high priest of partiality, Jonathan Munro, continues to defend the editorial decisions of the Panorama programme, does the Secretary of State believes that he too must go?
Well, he'll have heard the answer that I gave to my honourable friend. It's not for me to decide, or for any government to decide, who is employed by the BBC and who isn't. But of course, I agree with him that integrity and impartiality are vital.
Andrew Pakes.
you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like some of the colleagues in the House, I often start my morning with Dottie on BBC Cambridgeshire and end my days with Amelia on BBC Look East. I say this because it demonstrates that the BBC is much more than an editorial decision-making at its national level. Every day, thousands of BBC staff are telling our stories, representing our communities and being part of the fabric of this country. As a former BEC2 official, I've spoken with many BBC staff at NUJ and BEC2 members over recent days who are horrified by some of the coverage that's happening around this. They want accountability and they want the BBC to restore its trust, but they also want a message that their work is valued and that they are part of the future of a BBC and the future of public service broadcasting. Would my right honourable member agree with me? It's the talent that makes the BBC an institution, and that talent needs to be nurtured as well as dealing with its leadership.
Can I thank him, not just for the point that he makes, but the really compelling way in which he makes it. Like him, I have been astonished by the calibre of BBC staff, whether it's the back office staff that so often don't get the credit, the journalists who work tirelessly in communities up and down the country to tell stories that would otherwise not be heard, or whether it's the young apprentices who start out with the most incredible opportunities and go on to have amazing careers because of the institution that is the BBC and the work that is done to support them. I know this has had an impact on many BBC journalists. I do want them to hear directly from this government how much we value, treasure and support them. I do also want to say to the House that in all of the conversations I've had with major investors who come to this country to invest in film and TV production here, the BBC is, for all of them, without exception, a major draw because of the work that it does in skilling up a generation of talent and providing the institutions and facilities that they need in order to come here.
Sir Julian Smith.
So there we are. That's the Culture Secretary in the Commons calling the BBC a national institution, by far the most widely used source of...
And other scandals over the past few years. Also governance. We've got BBC Studios, a commercial organisation with separate whistleblowing schemes whilst hiding behind the BBC brand. Would you reflect on the broader skills needed to make the changes necessary so the BBC can maximise the huge global opportunities, both in news and in productions?
He's absolutely right to raise the issue of the handling, lack of deftness, and also, I would add, lack of urgency in relation to some of these issues that have arisen over the past couple of years. I would say to him, let this be the moment that this changes. That is the tone and nature of the conversations that I've been having with the senior leadership of the BBC. And I would also echo the points that he makes about the skill sets that are required in order to make sure that the BBC can get onto a firm footing as we begin this next chapter.
Sonia Antoniazzi.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm no BBC basher. I want to protect it. I've written to the Secretary of State this morning, along with a number of cross-party MPs, asking if she will ask the BBC board exactly why it delayed issuing an appropriate apology over the Panorama Trump edit, because this delay, as we know, inflicted further damage on the BBC, our country's most trusted news source. And I agree with Hannah Barnes that she said in an article yesterday in the New Statesman that the corporation must turn this crisis into an opportunity. So will she also seek clarity from the former Director General Tim Davie about the worrying words in his resignation letter that the BBC needs to be championed and not weaponised?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for the letter that I received earlier today. I have discussed this particular issue with the BBC about the delay in issuing an apology. I've been given a full account by the chairman of the board. It's not for me to answer on behalf of the BBC, but she will have heard that the Select Committee intends to call members of that committee, and I'm sure this will be a question that they'll raise with them.
Pete Wishart.
Madam Deputy Speaker, debates about partiality, of course, is something that we in Scotland are more than familiar with, particularly if you're on the 50% side of Scottish independence. But these sustained attacks on the BBC by forces that seek to undermine and mould it into their instrument must be resisted. And surely this could be assisted by the sacking of Robbie Gibb. But will she assure me that any changes in leadership, BBC Scotland's editorial independence will be maintained and it will continue to serve us according to our national debate and our political culture.
Well, he'll have heard the comments that I made about the legal threshold that must be met for any changes in leadership. The government appoints the chair of the BBC. We don't appoint individual staff members, and the board member that he mentioned was appointed by the last Conservative government, and his term was renewed just weeks before the general election. So I'm unable to take the action that he requests. But in terms of, he mentions nations and regions, which are very close to my heart as well. Through the Charter review process, we will be seeking to ensure that the nations and regions of the BBC are able to drive the direction of the organisation, and that people in every part of the UK will be able to see a fair share of content that reflects their lives, their communities and their contribution.
Daniel Zeitler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I spent time yesterday with journalists at BBC Radio Cambridgeshire, admiring their dedication and professionalism, which stands in marked contrast to this shabby debacle that sullies a great institution's reputation. But isn't part of the problem the fragmentation of what should be a public service? And frankly, this failure is symptomatic of the long-term fragmentation of so many of our public services, which have been a consequence of the party opposite.
Well, as I said to the House just a moment ago, the Charter review marks the start of the next chapter of the BBC and its long and proud history, and that will be the moment when we will be able to come together as a whole House and as a whole country to agree the future of the BBC.
Spirit Hophouse.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are certainly many questions, particularly to those who deliberately set out to destroy the BBC. But I want to ask her this particular question in the absence of not being able to remove certain members from the board. Can she not make a commitment that all future appointments should be conducted through a transparent process rather than being political appointments?
Well, the House was asked to approve the terms of the last Charter, and similarly the House will be asked to approve the terms of the next Charter, which will set out how the BBC will operate for the next decade. It will certainly look at issues around appointments and transparency and structures as well. That will be her opportunity to get involved.
Pamela Nash.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many have expressed their annoyance at the BBC in recent days for being too woke or too Tory or too liberal, or in my case, for allowing the Honourable Member for Clacton to appear on the Question Time panel more often than he's appeared on his own constituency. But isn't the fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the BBC has been attacked by every side evidence that the BBC continues to make every effort to maintain balance in a world of increasingly polarised and divisive media?
She makes the important point that although none of us should seek to downplay the seriousness of the failings which the BBC has admitted, accepted, apologised for, and now must show tangible action in order to address, the BBC is and remains the most trusted source of news in this country, and one of the most trusted sources of news all over the world, and we lose it at its peril, at our peril.
Rebecca Paul.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like many here, I want to see the BBC rebuild public trust and return to its core mission. But it must be recognised that as a result of its pro-gender ideology bias, they failed to adequately report on issues such as the use of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones in children, the placing of violent men in women's prisons, and the loss of women's medals in sport to biological males. And on top of all that, they've attributed the crimes of violent men to women. Calling a male sex offender she can never be responsible, impartial journalism. How does the Secretary of State intend to ensure that the BBC moves away from its current ideological approach on gender to one that is based on facts and evidence?
Secretary of State.
Well, I'll just gently say to the Honourable Lady that she wants the BBC to return to its core mission, but that is deeply contested, as you could just hear in this House. I don't believe that it is the role of elected politicians to tell any broadcaster what they can and can't produce, what they can and can't say, or to get involved in the minutiae of editorial decisions. I do think it is the right and proper role of this House to make sure that editorial standards are robust, they are thorough, they are well thought through and they're applied consistently. That's what this government has been seeking to uphold in the conversations that we've had with the BBC in recent weeks and will continue to do so.
Graham Morris.
Thank you. These are indeed uncertain times for the BBC and for the people who work in it. Would the Secretary of State agree with me that it's important that we remember that the 2025 Reuters Institute Digital News Report found that the BBC remains the most trustworthy news brand in the UK, with 60% of respondents rating it highly for trust? And would the Secretary of State also agree that the BBC must respond to criticism in a considered and proportionate manner, carrying out investigations with regard to due process, and should not be subject to political interference, nor for that matter interference from commercial competitors?
He's absolutely right to raise the point about trust. The BBC is one of the most trusted institutions, not just in our country, but in the world. We seek to ensure that they uphold the highest standards because that is of such value and importance to all of us in the United Kingdom. And can I thank him for his words?
Ben Lake.
I was very pleased to hear the Secretary of State confirm that the nations and regions will form a very important part of the BBC Charter Review. And to that end, she will know, of course, that over 90% of S4C's funding is derived from the BBC licence fee. So can I ask her that in the process of the BBC Charter Review, the financial stability of S4C will be a key consideration for the government?
Very pleased to meet with the leadership at S4C after what's been a difficult time. This government reaffirms the importance of S4C to our national life, and I look forward to working with him as we start the Charter Review process to make sure that that continues.
Matt Rodder.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, staff at the former BBC monitoring station in Caversham in my constituency played a vital role over many years monitoring broadcasts from around the world, and indeed they broke a number of important news stories over the years, including the Iranian Revolution, only possible because of the public service model. I welcome the Secretary of State's statement today. Could I ask her to say a few words of thanks to the staff of the BBC for their continued work and its vital role as a public institution?
Yes, you'll have heard the comments that I made earlier in response to my honourable friend. I want to commend those many BBC staff, particularly those who put themselves in danger in order to report fearlessly from parts of the world where that is not possible. Recently, I came to this dispatch box to pay tribute to all of those journalists operating in Gaza in particular, where the loss of life has been without precedent. We owe them a great debt of thanks, and I'd like to place that on record today.
Sir Roger Gale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a very long time since I was taught to edit tape with a China graph pencil and a razor blade. But the fundamental principle remains the same. You don't change the sense of what somebody has said, ever. Those who have read the transcript of Trump's speech and then compared it with the Panorama edit know full well that that programme was a travesty of journalism and deeply dishonest. And it also represented a desperate lack of editorial control. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I part company now with some of my colleagues. I believe, and I still believe, that the overwhelming majority of the journalists employed by the BBC, and for the record, those employed by independent television and Sky News, work fearlessly, faithfully, and honestly to deliver the truth. And where those are working overseas, as has been said, with great courage also. And I hope the Secretary of State, therefore, will resist, with all her power, the calls of those on both sides of this House and outside it, who would seek to destroy what is one of the jewels in our national crown.
Secretary of State.
I'm happy to give him that assurance.
Joe Morris.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I echo solidarity with BBC journalists that's been expressed across the House. Can the Secretary of State assure myself and other members that measures will be taken in the forthcoming Charter Review to ensure that all political appointments to the BBC board are made with full public scrutiny and that such appointees will not be involved in any editorial capacity in the future in order to protect the integrity, credibility and independence of the most important bastion of public service broadcasting in Britain and beyond.
Can I thank the Honourable Member for his words, and can I also thank members across this House for the tone of this debate. I know that the failings of the BBC editorial process in recent days are something that all members feel very strongly about, but it is a credit to this House that we can have a sensible and measured debate about the actions that are needed to address it.
Sian Berry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The BBC employs thousands of tremendous journalists working with diligent truth-seeking and impartiality. It's not perfect, but we must defend this national asset, and we cannot be left to the wolves of the kind of channels Trump prefers, which have propaganda values, not ethics and integrity. So will the Secretary of State protect our BBC from all further political interference, listen to the cross-party voices here and put an end to all political appointments and remove those already in place, like Robbie Gibb, if not immediately, then in that process?
She'll have heard my comments to other honourable members about the appointments process, and the Charter Review offers this whole House the opportunity to look again at how those appointments are made and which roles exist. In relation to the points that she makes about the BBC and the environment in which it's operating, this is something that we as a government are particularly concerned about. The blurring of news and fact with opinion and polemic, and therefore the inability of viewers to turn on their TV screens and understand what it is that they're watching. I've raised with the Select Committee previously my concerns about politicians presenting news on programmes that are not necessarily deemed news programmes. As politicians, we are required to have an opinion and a point of view. That is very different from presenting impartial facts, and it's something that this government is looking to address.
Alex Mayer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The BBC is unique and special and ours. And yes, it's absolutely a part of the national conversation. But importantly, it's also a part of the regional and local conversation. I have fantastic local journalists in my patch on 3 Counties Radio and on Look East. And what's special is that if you have a local story that a local journalist has gone out to find, it can so quickly get onto the national stage because of our BBC. Would the Secretary of State assure me that in the forthcoming Charter Review, she will take very seriously the issue of local news coverage to make sure that that is protected and enhanced?
Secretary of State.
I'm happy to give that assurance. We're looking both at the charter process and how we can help to support and defend local news through the work that the BBC does, but also she will know that this government is developing a local news strategy to help our local newspapers to be able to survive and thrive in an era in which they face significant pressure. And she's absolutely right to say that this is not just about reflecting the whole nation, although that is an essential role that local news plays. It's also often the training ground for some of our most talented journalists who would otherwise not get those opportunities, and so we're determined to strengthen and protect it.
Sir Julian Lewis.
I would fight in the last ditch to prevent the BBC ceasing to be a public service broadcaster and to prevent it being broken up. Any large organisation can have bad actors who behave unethically, and that has happened on this occasion. But it does the BBC no service when people parrot the line that the person responsible for this crisis is not the idiot who tampered with Donald Trump's quote, but a former Tory spin doctor, one of 13 members of the board who allegedly influenced other members of the board to somehow provoke this present crisis. The crisis has nothing to do with Robbie Gibb. It has something to do with a mindset that on the front page of today's Guardian has the whole thing about Robbie Gibb and relegates the fact that $1 billion lawsuit may be taken out by Donald Trump against the BBC to a tiny paragraph at the end of the article on page 2. If you want to know what's wrong with some bits of the BBC, read The Guardian today.
Secretary of State.
I'm not, Madam Deputy, I'm not entirely sure how to respond to that, but I think the honourable member's views are now on the record.
Chris Kane.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we've heard an awful lot today about the professionalism of the journalists at the BBC, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. But there's less of them now than there was last year, and we hear that the BBC is in the fight of its life across a whole number of fronts. Well, when you're in a fight across multiple fronts, it seems odd to send some of your best fighters home, but that's what's happening to our journalists, where there are less of them in our newsrooms. Does she agree with me that journalism delivered free from fear or favour costs money, and it costs a lot of money to do it really, really well? So delivering that has to be at the centre of gravity for the BBC now and in the future, and how we protect journalism and resource it properly has to be at the heart of the Charter Review.
Secretary of State.
Yes, I agree with him, and can I assure him that that is very much central to the Charter Review process that we are about to begin. He's right to say that fearless and robust journalism costs money. It's essential that the BBC is fairly and sustainably resourced for years to come. As a government, we are keeping an open mind about how that may unfold. But what I have said, and I'm happy to repeat to this House today, is that we have ruled out funding the BBC through general taxation, because whilst it's absolutely essential that good journalism is well resourced, it is also absolutely essential that the BBC remains independent from government and is able to hold us to account without fear or favour.
Manuela Pertegala.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's essential that the BBC's independence and impartiality are upheld at all times. And I'm afraid there have been serious concerns raised about Sir Robbie Gibb's conduct on the BBC board, including alleged attempts to influence recruitment and editorial decisions. So if the Secretary of State cannot remove Gibb from the board and cannot end political appointments now, what actions can she take to restore public confidence in the BBC governance?
I would just start by saying that although everyone in this House is right to take with the utmost seriousness the failings that the BBC has accepted have happened over the course of this year, I would also just gently push back against the idea that the public has lost confidence in the BBC. It does remain the most trusted source of news in this country, and as I said earlier, in many parts of the world as well. In terms of the actions that I can take as the Secretary of State, I'm working very closely to support the Chairman of the Board through what are obviously tumultuous times. The Director General has agreed to stay on in order to see the organisation through that transition. We've already had discussions about the process for recruiting for a new Director General and the need to strengthen the work of the board and senior leadership when it comes to editorial oversight. That includes, as I said in answer to the Honourable Gentleman a moment ago, a discussion about the mix of skills and experience that is needed at the highest levels of the organisation.
Brash.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Secretary of State's statement today because, of course, it's absolutely right to hold the BBC to the highest standard, because that's actually the best way to defend our national broadcaster. But does she agree with me that it's not acceptable for members of this House who are paid by the BBC's commercial rivals, in fact, looking at the time, one of them's probably in makeup as we speak, to use their status as an MP to mount sustained and frenzied attacks that have only one aim: to destroy this British national institution?
Secretary of State.
Well, as I said to the House earlier, there is a difference between the absolutely legitimate and right and proper role of members of this House to raise serious concerns about the decisions that have been made at the BBC over recent months and the response to them. There is a difference between that and a sustained attack on an institution that has stood at the centre of public life for over a century and belongs to us all.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State very much for her answers in the statement. It has been clear over years that there's been a bias in the BBC. I have concerns over the last 12 months on at least 4 topics. BBC bias against Brexit, BBC bias against my party, the DUP, elected representatives back home in Northern Ireland who refused to engage with the BBC, BBC bias for Gaza against Israel, BBC bias against Free Iran government in exile, with the BBC promoting the son of a former dictator. My goodness me, it's quite unbelievable. 2 people have resigned, but the canker of editorial control is still there. So, Secretary of State, the question I have today is just when will it end? Is this just a pause, or is this the end? Thank you.
Secretary of State.
Well, can I reassure him that, as somebody who has shared my frustrations with some of the failures at the BBC over the last 16 months and my frustrations about the response at times, that I have felt very much throughout this process that there is a recognition of the seriousness of this at the highest levels of the BBC. And in the conversations that I've had with senior leadership in the institution, there is also a discussion and a consideration of what wider changes need to be made in order to maintain and uphold the highest standards going forwards. He asked when will it end. I think the answer to that has to be now.
Jim Dixon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I welcome the statement from the Secretary of State, particularly her strong support for the BBC as an institution that belongs to us all. Does she agree with me that, as she noted, with the BBC regularly rated worldwide as one of the most trusted news sources globally, that a strong BBC not only acts as a bulwark locally and in this country against misinformation, but also across other parts of the world, critical parts of the world, where there are very few other trusted news sources, and that in delivering services to those parts of the world, those services must be properly funded as well.
Secretary of State.
I do agree with him, and it's not lost on anyone in this House that at a time when other countries who don't necessarily have the UK's best interests at heart are investing heavily in state-funded propaganda, it's essential that the BBC continues to be a light on the hill for people in times of darkness.
David Mundell.
I've long been a champion of the BBC as a UK national institution, but at the last Charter review I did raise my concerns about the prevalence of a metropolitan elite at the heart of the BBC, not just at UK level but in Scotland, who don't always convey that they understand or indeed respect rural or older constituents like my own. So will the Secretary of State confirm that an outcome of this Charter review will be that in order to preserve the BBC as a national institution, it will convey that understanding of people right across the UK, wherever they live?
I can and I will, and I do share his view that the story of the whole nation has to be told, and the best way to ensure that it is told is to ensure that all of us are involved in telling it, not just some. So when we look at the Charter review, there will be a particular focus on our nations and regions. I've said previously that although I absolutely commend the work that the BBC has done, they've been leaders in this field at moving jobs, programming and skills out of London. What I want to see is a shift in commissioning power so that in every nation and region, we decide the story that we tell about ourselves to ourselves as a nation.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We should be rigorous in holding the BBC to account, especially when it makes mistakes. But does my right honourable friend agree that some of those who jump on any infraction with glee may have ulterior motives? And does she further agree that the BBC is a beacon of fearless, impartial journalism here and abroad? And that as misinformation and disinformation grow, as attempts to attack media outlets by those suspicious of its values are on the rise. The BBC is needed more than ever.
I agree with him about the centrality of the BBC to our public life, and all of us in this House, I think, should be rightly seeking to ensure that the BBC upholds the highest standards whilst defending, protecting it as an institution and considering together how we can ensure that it stands at the centre of our public life for many more decades to come.
Sir Alex Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was pleased to hear the government last week announce that in the education curriculum they're going to be tackling fake news and what that's about. And I always say to children when I go to the schools about how you can trust journalism is, can you sue the person who wrote it? So I actually welcome the writ that's coming from America. I hope it can be sorted out, but I welcome that writ purely to say that if something's wrong, you can do it. But the basis of why we're here today, and forget all of the politicking about who's on the board and what is it about Trump or anything else, is that the BBC faked a piece of news. And how that happened, we've really got to get to the heart of. So may I ask the Secretary of State that she uses her offices to work with the current Director General to get right to the heart of how this was ever allowed to happen, because that fundamentally is, we've heard and we all believe that the BBC is a respected journalistic organisation, but this is probably the biggest crisis it currently faces, because right now you can honestly say they faked the news.
Secretary of State.
Well, he asks if I'll use the office that I hold to ensure that we get to the bottom of this and that there's full transparency. I will, of course, do that, and I think the whole House will also be grateful to the Honourable Member, the Chair of the Select Committee, for taking action quickly to make sure that account is open to the public and transparent as well.
Gregory Campbell.
Deputy Speaker, sometimes there is a case of the Westminster bubble when assessing things like the BBC and then the real world outside. Some of us in Northern Ireland have been pressing the BBC for many, many years to be more transparent, to be more independent, to be more impartial. So this latest debacle is but one in a long line. And we're not talking about light entertainment or drama. No one questions that, and that by and large gets a green light from most people. It is news and current affairs. And there's no point in people distracting by introducing a conspiracy within the BBC board. Is now not the time for an opportunity to start afresh with a transformed BBC service to give us an impartial news service that many of us have demanded for years?
Secretary of State.
Well, the Charter Review will provide us with an opportunity to do just that.
Dr Andrew Murrison.
Speaker, why does the Minister think that the national leadership of the BBC has spent hundreds of thousands of pounds of licence fee payers' money resisting attempts to get the publication of the Biden report in 2004? And does she suspect, like I do, that it might be because the conclusions drawn 20 years ago very similar to the conclusions that have been made apparent in the now leaked Michael Prescott report, particularly around a culture that makes it possible for it to be okay to doctor and distort the facts in order to suit a pre-formed agenda.
Well, I think that's a question for the BBC, but when the editorial members of the editorial committee appear before the Select Committee, I'm sure that is something that the committee will rightly challenge them on.
Al Pinkerton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Earlier this year, as part of the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme, I had the great privilege of visiting the 77th Brigade, the Russian anti-disinformation brigade of the British Army, down in Newbury. And what they told us there, from the experts who are on the front line of the information wars, is that the British population, every single day, are being subjected to thousands and tens of thousands of messages designed to seed distrust between government and citizen, to break our belief in our institutions. The United Kingdom is in an incredibly privileged position in that we have a state broadcaster that provides us with something that might resemble a national culture. If we were to lose that, we would be feeding the forces that stand against us. Does the Secretary of State agree with me, or does the Minister agree with me, that The BBC provides a vital connection to our past. It unifies us together. And as well as being a source of education, information and entertainment, it's also a great source of national resilience.
Secretary of State.
I agree with him, and I think if the BBC didn't exist in the times that we live in, we'd be seeking to invent it.
Peter Fortune.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Just to touch on something that the Secretary of State alluded to earlier, one of the vital services that the BBC provides is supporting local media, an industry that I worked in for 10 years. And they do this through their local democracy reporting scheme, and it helps to bring forward the next generation of journalists and reporters. So would she agree with me that it is imperative, therefore, that the BBC win back the trust and the discipline and the culture of impartiality so that this can be inculcated into the next generation of journalists so that they can report without fear or favour?
Secretary of State.
I do agree with him, and that's why this government will also resist attacks on the institution itself from members across this whole House who voiced those in recent days. The local democracy reporting service that he talks about is a vital part of our local democracy. It also helps to create the next generation of journalists who might not otherwise have opportunities to work in journalism and have the opportunity to tell the stories that matter so much to all of us across this House.
Annalise Midgley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Robbie Gibb, faithful or traitor?
Secretary of State.
Perhaps the Honourable Lady and I can hear her views about that over a few drinks later on.
Sammy Wilson.
Madam Deputy Speaker. The fact of the matter is, this is not just about manipulating the speech of a president who the BBC clearly detest. There were other allegations made about promoting Hamas propaganda, about producing fake stories about race bias, about censoring people who were gender critical, and promoting stories, one-sided view of climate change and a whole range of other issues. And what has been the response of the BBC? To roll out the lefty lovies to try and justify their position and then indicate that they were victims of some right-wing coup. Does a response not show that this body, which has fabricated the news, misused its monopoly, and hidden behind the protection of politicians in this House, far too cowardly to take them on over the years? Does this not show that this body is not capable of change? And like many millions across the United Kingdom, I object to paying for this. And I hope that in the review, the Minister will decide that there should be no more enforced taxation. No more enforced taxation.
Secretary of State.
Well, it won't surprise him to learn that I don't agree with that, and I don't share his characterisation of an institution that plays a vital role in this country. I just gently say to him, I don't think most people do either, and whilst I'm sure the public have been extremely concerned about the very serious failings that have been accepted this week by the BBC, it still remains the most trusted source of news in this country. I would also just say to all members of this House that there's been a lot of discussion today about individuals and individuals who are held to be responsible for all of the problems at the BBC, whether they're individuals who serve on the board or individuals who serve as senior executives. My assessment of the failures that have been admitted over recent years is that they stem from not an institutional bias, but a need to have sufficient rigour and oversight at the top of the organisation that is applied consistently across the board. That is something that I know the chairman of the BBC is seeking to achieve, and as a government we stand ready to support them in that.
Pam Cox.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the early 2000s, I lived in Hanoi alongside my husband, who was reporting on Vietnam for the BBC, and I saw for myself how he and the BBC worked very hard for truth. He then spent a year in Myanmar working alongside extraordinarily brave local journalists under a military dictatorship who were seeking to expand public broadcasting. So does the Secretary of State agree with me that the BBC's trusted journalism is one of our strongest defences against disinformation, both at home and abroad.
Secretary of State.
I do agree with her, and I'd also like to pay tribute to the work that BBC Verify does in helping to empower our citizens to be able to navigate a very difficult news environment.
Rupert Lowe.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Auntie is definitively a monopoly. When Mr. Reith, for good reason, wrote into the Charter that she should inform, educate and entertain with complete impartiality, he did it for good reason. This recent disgusting episode with this Panorama programme, where we've undermined our relationship probably with our greatest ally, is just the tip of the iceberg. So would the Minister agree with me that now is the time to responsibly defund this monopoly? And if she doesn't agree with that, would she agree it's time for root and branch reform, with a view to ensuring that, in the same way that she's done with football club boards, we see people who are actually forced to pay for this service represented across the country on the board of the BBC?
Secretary of State.
Well, it won't surprise him to learn that I strongly disagree with him on the first point. On the latter point, the issue of public accountability to the public is something that my honourable friend raised a moment ago, and is something that we've been thinking about with the senior leadership of the BBC and others as we approach the Charter review, and it's certainly something that I'd be happy to discuss with him.
Carla Lockhart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last week we learned that the BBC upheld a complaint about their presenter Martine Croxall. Her alleged issue was that she correctly changed the wording of pregnant people to women. This is a scientific fact. Somehow the BBC found her eye roll as conveying a personal view. Madam Deputy Speaker, there are two genders, male and female, and one of those genders can become pregnant, women. This is the view of the Supreme Court. Would the Secretary of State therefore ensure that the BBC leadership abide by the court ruling, and would she agree that their lefty, woke agenda is certainly not in step with the majority of right-thinking people who want common sense at the core of broadcasting?
I don't agree with her characterisation of the BBC, and it is not, I'm sure most members would agree with me, that it is not for the Secretary of State to start writing editorial guidelines for the BBC on the floor of the House of Commons. My job is, though, to work with the senior leadership to make sure that they have the right structures and people in place so that they have well thought through, easily understood and consistent editorial guidelines of the highest standard that are applied consistently and don't leave presenters and journalists struggling to interpret them.